So hello everybody, welcome back to the Game House. Now, being a streamer, being an esports athlete is something that is becoming more and more viable every single day. More and more people want to do it. I mean, you just had the most popular Twitch streamer ever sign an exclusive deal with a completely different streaming platform. That some people say that the deal that was signed by Ninja to go from Twitch to Mixer was in the range of 6 years, $900 million. Holy crap, that's a lot of money. So now, what so now one of the things I wanted to talk about was the law behind being a streamer, being an independent contractor, being your own business from the word go. And I have with me today a friend, and I can genuinely say he's a friend because we talk to each other face to face. This is somebody I've actually met in real life. I've shaken his hand. I've sat with him at a coffee shop, and we've discussed all sorts of wonderful things. I have with me today my friend Eric. He's a lawyer in the same area that I live in. And Eric, thanks for uh, making time for me this morning. I know that you're an extremely busy man, so go ahead and introduce yourself real quick. Then we'll get into some of the law aspects of being an independent contractor. So, sir, go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody.
All right, thanks, Bill. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this podcast. I appreciate your invitation. My name is Eric Shu. I own Clear Focus Law. That's my very, very small practice that I've had for, since 2011. One of the areas, basically what I do is I work with a lot of small business owners, help them build valuable businesses, essentially, in all aspects of covering the legal aspects as well as a lot of the other dynamics involved in growing a small business and sometimes turning it even into a big business. One of the areas that I've been interested in from day one is the digital space. And that's been with digital entrepreneurs who, in the 2011 days, we really didn't have esports. So these were a lot of people who were opening social media agencies, doing contract work in that area, helping people get started on social media, all the way until today, when I've been working now with a lot of digital entrepreneurs in many different ways, including in esports. So again, I really appreciate being here today, being able to help you and your listeners. I do have a very virtual law practice, and so I'm licensed to help people in Washington. And even though, Bill, as you mentioned, you and I live in the same geographic area, I am set up with a total virtual practice and can help anyone in the entire state of Washington.
Very nice. Okay, so let's start this off by saying, okay, so I decide that I want to be a streamer, that I have enough of a following. I love to game, and I want to serve the community that I have created. So as a streamer, I would assume, and I would assume, and if I'm wrong, go ahead and correct me, that being an online personality, being in the entertainment space, has a lot of being in that space. I'm sure that there's a lot of things that can go wrong. I'm sure that there are a lot of pitfalls, a lot of legal stumbling blocks, I guess is a good way to put it. So as somebody who wants to be an independent contractor, accept donations, deal with sponsors, sort of. So from your experience, now, give me three things that I, as somebody who wants to be a full time streamer or an esports competitor, what are three basic things that I need to watch out for?
Well, I think that the very first thing, and if we want to talk about kind of action steps, is to make sure that you are not going into business as yourself, as a sole proprietor, because from a liability perspective, and you're right, this is a area that has a whole ton of opportunity. I mean, we're kind of in the Wild West, so to speak, days of esports,
Yeah.
and money is changing hands at paces that we've never seen before. The average person thinking, boy, this, I can almost name my price if I've got enough of a value. It's the opportunity is wide open, but the risks are also wide open, and sometimes risks that you don't even know about. So I think the number one consideration is how to enter this field as a legitimate business. And I know a lot of your listeners who are thinking of doing this have established a brand for themselves. So they might be, Joe Smith, and known as that throughout the industry. It doesn't mean that they should go into contracts with whether it be businesses that are going to be paying them to do sponsorships, or even entering into contracts with agents as Joe Smith. They need to create a legal entity to protect themselves. And Bill, the way that works is if they, and my recommended legal entity for anyone going into this space, because it's so easy to create and maintain, is to be an LLC. And so they need to create an LLC, get that done right, operate that right, and then they have a great layer of protection to start protecting them from all the pitfalls that come in this space. And I can name a few of those, or we can get into them a little later, or I can jump into kind of the other two things that I recommend.
So before we do that, I want to give some more detail on what you just said. Sole proprietor versus LLC. So a sole proprietor would be a sole proprietor, and then taking it out of the digital space is basically I make cupcakes and I sell them to people. And so I could call it Bill Wagner's Cupcakes, and I use my own oven in my own house to make these cupcakes and I sell them. And then an LLC would be the formal legal structure that I create, and I have a business name, and the business name, could be Extremely Bad Cupcakes, and I'm the owner of Extremely Bad Cupcakes. So from my understanding, and if I'm wrong, correct me, the difference between a sole proprietor and an LLC from a business standpoint is, say that my cupcakes, I don't give a full list of ingredients with the cupcakes, and somebody eats a cupcake and I handled peanuts that day and they're allergic to peanuts, but it doesn't list that in the ingredients, so they sue me. If I'm a sole proprietor and they sue me, they can not only come after the business, they can also come after my personal funds, my house, my car. They can take money from my kids. Whereas with an LLC, all they can do is sue the business itself, right?
Yes, that's a great way to put it, Bill, because that is exactly correct. With an LLC, your business assets are in a separate airtight container, and if you do business appropriately with people in that way, then if things went wrong, then yes, they get to sue the LLC and not you personally. They don't get to access your personal assets. They get to access your LLC's assets, access your LLC's insurance policy, and that's how you want it.
Got it. Okay, so that's your first step right there, is to set up an LLC. Okay, so now as far as so that's the first one. So now the other two, what are they?
I would say the second one is to understand that you should never sign a contract you don't understand. And I'd be happy to go into kind of the features in contracts that are disadvantageous for people to sign, but I've helped a lot of people in this space deal with contracts after the fact, help them negotiate contracts, and I think contracts are the second biggest stumbling block area that I see, simply because they're so, there's so many variables in them, and a lot of times if you're just handed a contract, say again, whether it's with on a product deal with a company that wants you to give them a sponsor, or wants to sponsor you, or with an agency, most of the time when you're just handed a contract, they're written in favor of the other side and not to you. And so I think contracts and spotting issues in there are the number 2 issue.
Okay, so let's stop right there. So when you say don't sign a contract that you don't understand, that would require me as a streamer, as the person who runs the LLC, to also be doing a little research on my end. And I've dealt with contracts, and they can be 9 pages, they can be 900 pages. I've seen this happen. You could literally have a novel for a contract that, and when it comes to defining the terms in these contracts, what you're dealing with, at least from what I've seen, is you're dealing with, what you're dealing with is not only the basics of, okay, what's the company involved, what's the product and or service involved, what's the duration, but then you also have to deal with, what if you have a disagreement after the contract? What if you have a disagreement after the contract is signed? How do you handle the disagreement? Do you go to court? Do you go to arbitration? Where is the, and this is something that people don't understand, where is the contract in force? Because, and this is something I talked about, the FaZe versus Tfue legal battle is now at a stage where FaZe is saying that FaZe is saying their contract is in force in New York, and you have Tfue's lawyers saying no, but FaZe operates in California. So then you have to decide on which venue has jurisdiction, and there's just so many details in contracts. So Eric, for somebody who just wants to stream and they just want to be with their friends online and hang out and maybe take some donations, and if someone sponsors them, that's great. Where can somebody go to get a breakdown of contract language and what goes into contracts? I'm sure that there are some I'm sure that there are some websites out there, right?
You're probably right. I actually don't know of any off the top of my head, just simply because I don't think a lot of people are willing to do that level of education, both because it's kind of open-ended. It's like, where do you begin and where do you end? And what happens if someone goes to your site and reviews all that, and then they try to analyze? It's like doing surgery on yourself. It doesn't turn out well, and what happens to the person who puts that information out there? So I don't really know of any good places to kind of get a contracts 101 overview, because simply because you might have a contracts 101 understanding of contracts, but these contracts that are being thrown at influencers and esports people out there, they're not unsophisticated contracts that you might get from LegalZoom.
Right.
These are usually drafted by in-house counsel, who usually have 10 plus years in some law firm practicing in the digital space. The contracts that I've seen in the digital space have been incredibly complicated and sophisticated. Sometimes even where I'll review a contract for a client, and it'll take me digging in and really almost diagramming out their definitions before I realize, whoa, wait a second, did you know you're getting into this? And they'd be like, oh no, I didn't.
Right.
And so it's, I guess the short answer to that is I don't know where to send someone to kind of get an education on contracts, unfortunately.
Well, so I would say I would say that you might know that answer, and I would say that the person should call you, right?
Well, yeah, I do recommend that they have an attorney who's experienced in the digital space look it over. Most attorneys, I think, kind of that work with entrepreneurs are going to quote a pretty reasonable flat fee to say, hey, for X $100 or whatever, depending on the size of the contract. Yeah, I'll look it over.
Right.
And usually an attorney who's used to looking over contracts can look over a contract in a reasonable amount of time and say, all right, it looks great, or these 5 things you should watch out for. In fact, I don't think I've ever reviewed a contract for a client and not said, hey, did you know this? Did you know that? Here are some areas to be aware of. Just because it's so contracts, you can contract into just about anything.
Yes.
And sometimes they try to convince you to contract into all sorts of crazy things.
Yes, I agree. Okay, so we had the first step is to create an LLC. The second step is to make sure that if you get a contract, read it. If you don't understand, ask the questions. Do your research. Okay, so the third thing is what?
Well, I think the third thing is a little bit of a tie, and that's understanding a couple of the biggest areas that I see people getting into trouble with, and that's a combination of regulatory compliance, and the big ticket item there is the Federal Trade Commission for influencers and sponsorships, and then the other aspect is intellectual property, and that's where I see people getting in trouble online is thinking they can use other people's intellectual property. And so I think understanding what the parameters and the boundaries of what you should and should not say as an influencer would be the number 3.
Okay, so when you so this is an interesting step, because when it comes to regulatory compliance, what's legal in California may not necessarily be legal in Florida, in New York, in Texas. So how do you, as a lawyer, who's somebody who is fully certified to practice in Washington State, how do you advise somebody? How do you advise a digital entrepreneur who might be reaching out to people who might not just be in this country, but I mean, you could be talking Canada, Mexico, Japan, things like that.
Well, that's a tough one, because once you start getting international, then it's hard for me to advise them on everything they need to know.
Okay.
I'm very aware of the federal regulations, and luckily, I think most of the regulations on what you can and cannot say, and what you should and should not do as an influencer are regulated federally. I know California keeps jumping on the bandwagon and having their own sets of a lot of times it's privacy regulations, and
Okay.
they can be pretty onerous. But most of the time, and I say this as a bit of a generality with caveats, most of the time it's going to affect the people where they are actually doing business. And so if you're doing business here in Washington, then the biggest set of rules that you need to follow are Washington rules.
Okay.
If you're doing business in California, then the biggest set of rules are California in addition to federal, and you'd better get a California attorney. If you're doing business here in Washington, then get a Washington attorney, and they should be able to advise you on what you should comply with.
Okay. And then the other part of that you talked about was the intellectual property piece. So explain to people what you mean by that, because what some people, I don't know that some people really understand what intellectual property is.
Sure. I think the 2 biggest pieces of intellectual property is anyone else's trademark, anyone else's copyrighted material, and then anyone else's patent, but that really isn't an issue. So I think as far as an influencer goes, we're talking about trademarks of other people. So if you start talking about Google, you start talking about Apple, you start talking about Microsoft, then you're using other people's trademarks, brand assets. And so
Okay.
if you start saying, You start using the slogan "I'm loving it," which is McDonald's slogan.
Right.
Then you're starting to use other people's trademark information. And on the same token, if you start using other people's copyrighted material, that's anything that they've published. So you start using a 2-minute snippet of another influencer's YouTube stream. That's by the fact that they created it and it's their original material. It's copyrighted. Um,
So,
some people. Sorry, go on.
okay, so I want to stop right there because I want to tie in what you said there and number two when it comes to contracts, because I've seen a lot of contracts that have terms that say to streamers, to influencers, to people in the online space, when you're doing the tasks that we want you to do for our product, whatever content you create out of that is that content belongs to us as the people who are who people who are supplying the product. And that's an important piece to consider in the contract, because really in the streaming space all you have is your content. And if you're going to be entering into a contract with a company for your content, which is essentially what you're doing here, who owns the content? And that's an important piece to work out. That is your intellectual property, that is your creativity. And in the same vein, when you hire somebody to make you graphics, make sure that you write into the agreement that you then retain those rights for yourself to republish. There's a lot here to consider that you wouldn't normally think about. But when you're dealing with big businesses who might be paying you $10,000, $20,000 per hour to do something, it those details can get very sticky very fast, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's one of those hidden things, Bill, that you hit on exactly. That I see a lot of times in contracts that sometimes clients don't realize. Sometimes I'll tell them, "Do you realize that you're signing over all of your rights in this content that you're producing? That they're paying you $10,000 a month for? Are you comfortable with that?" Sometimes it's a, "Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely." Sometimes it's a, "No, no, no, I didn't realize that," because if they own all the content, that means you don't ever get to use it again for any other purpose.
Exactly.
Um, and,
Exactly.
and so I think you were talking about, these are big businesses. Obviously, if they're going to pay you money, then they want you to sign a pretty one-sided contract. But I don't think that's where everything ends. I think a lot of your listeners need to understand that a lot of these contracts are negotiable.
Right.
So it might be that from the get-go, they try to get you to sign version A of the contract, which is the most one-sided version in favor of the company. But I think it's worth the while for your listeners to look at their own influence in the space. And if they're an influencer that's just starting out and this is one of their first deals, sure, they might end up needing to sign whatever the company puts before them. But let's fast forward, in this day and age, it's not a few years. Let's fast forward a few months, and suddenly they have 3 million followers, and they are the influencer to talk to in that space. Suddenly they've got some clout, and they get to say, "You know what? I'll do all this stuff for you, and maybe no, you're not going to own my content. You're going to have a license to it." And it becomes a negotiable process where the more influence and the more authority your listeners start getting when they want to get into this space in the business, the more they get to command better terms for their contracts. And I think that's something important to consider.
Yes.
Once you start getting to be big time, don't just sign everything that they put in front of you.
Right. And 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 that's one thing that you brought up. Great point, that these are contracts. It's an offer. You don't have to say yes. You can say no. You can say yes, but I want these changes. It's a negotiation. That's how you do business. It's a for anybody that's ever played poker, it's that it's the exact same thing. You're dealing with somebody. You're sitting across the table trying to engage in a mutually beneficial relationship. And if you don't like 3 words on page 12, say something. If you don't like item 26 under section 4, you got to say something. You know, you have to say, you're not going to own my content. It's my content. I created it. I want to be able to reuse it for other things down the line. You can have a license to it for, from a start date to an end date, and you can set that up in the contract. And it's funny because I talk to people about contracts, and they're worried about somebody being offended that you don't like something in the contract. But you actually create credibility for yourself when you push back. You create credibility by saying, no, we're not going to do it this way. Here's the way that I want it done. And I think that people are so desperate at times to have the success that they have a tendency to jump into agreements that they don't fully understand.
I completely agree, Bill, and I think something good to consider. We talked earlier about how this is kind of the Wild West in a developing area. I think a lot of influencers can use that to their advantage. It's not as if this is, the Screen Actors Guild that's been around for a long time and everybody kind of knows who's going to get paid what and what the terms of standard agreements are.
Right.
There's no such thing. And I honestly believe influencers hold the cards here.
Yeah.
The big corporations are suddenly waking up and going, whoa, what? There's such a thing as influencer marketing. What is it? And they're having their lawyers come in and asking them, what's this influencer marketing thing? And some of their lawyers are saying, influencer what? And they're having to reinvent the wheel from their side, suddenly realizing that they can reach people in ways that they've never imagined before on a very influential level, where one person can be their spokesperson with a built-in audience of 2 million people. People holding the cards are the influencers,
yeah,
not these corporations. And so I'd hope that they start realizing that and saying, you're exactly right there too, Bill, when you say that, when they say, no, this is kind of how I like to do business, that puts the power back into the hands of the influencer, where I think a lot of it really is the case here. And so sometimes I think it's a good idea for them to meet with an attorney ahead of time in the planning phase of their business, so that they know what the kind of some of the negotiation points are, and they can go into these negotiations saying, okay, no, I'm not going to agree to that really bad exit clause. I'm not going to agree to, you were talking earlier about what they call venue provisions. That just means where you're going to litigate something.
Right.
No, I'm based in Washington. I'm not going to agree to litigate something in California. If we're going to have a contract, you're going to agree to litigate it here in Washington. You can start setting out what your own ground rules are.
Right.
And then as the person holding the power, if you're again the influencer with the 1 million person following, you've got the power. And if you walk in knowing what you're going to accept and what you're not going to accept, then you're going to have a much better outcome at the end of the day. And like you say, you're going to have that reputation as someone with who's got the authority, who is kind of the dominant player.
Very nice, Eric. Hey, thank you very much for making time for me. So if somebody wants to get a hold of you and talk to you, what are some good ways to do that?
The best way is through my website, clearfocuslaw.com. As I mentioned earlier, I really cater to people online. This is a space I really enjoy working in, and so it provides really easy, very quick ways of getting in touch with me. I'm always available by phone, through my website, and also by secure video conferencing. And so one of the things that I'm, again, also very big into, because of kind of a lot of the snooping that goes on these days, is digital privacy and security. So I've got a lot of very secure tools I can use to work with anybody, anywhere. And so my website's the absolute best way to get in touch with me.
Very nice, Eric. Thanks for making time for me, my friend. I hope very much that we have educated people, and I know that this is a really deep conversation. We can go for probably another 45 minutes talking about all the details. There's a lot to do. There's a lot to talk about. I definitely want to have you back. I think that these details are these are details that people need to know. So Eric, thank you very much for thank you very much for chatting with me this morning, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Bill. I really appreciate it and look forward to our next coffee shop meeting.
Exactly. Thanks everybody for tuning in today to the Game House. If you like what we do on this YouTube channel, the content that we have, these interviews, the rundown of baseball, football, basketball, Overwatch, League of Legends. If you like what we do, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you soon.